Topic notes 5.6, cartilaginous fish. And of course, there's a lot of really cool animals to talk about in this particular note set. This happens to be one of them. It is a yellow stingray, which is a small type stingray that we find in our coastal waters here in South Florida. So our main idea today is that members of class Chondrichthyes play an important role in the environment and face numerous threats, including overfishing and pollution. Class Chondrichthyes, if you break the name down, Greek chondros meaning cartilage and ichthyos meaning fish. So we're talking cartilaginous fish, and this includes sharks, skates, rays, and chimeras. Now, cartilaginous fish essentially have a cartilaginous skeleton, right? And why do they have that? Well, it essentially is less weight, and it's more flexible than bone. And this helps them in quite a few different ways, as we'll get into as we go along. They do have a unique version of calcified cartilage that helps the strength part of the cartilage itself. Now, the majority are carnivores and scavengers. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, the first sharks evolved more than 400 million years ago. Now, unfortunately, the cartilaginous skeletons don't really fossilize very well, so most of the evidence we have is limited to teeth and impressions of scales and tissue. Now, there are some studies that are starting to indicate that sharks may have evolved from bony ancestors, essentially secondarily losing the calcification. And this is an example of that. This is a fossil of, well, we'll call it the go-go shark because it's got a long name, but it's found from Australia. It's about a 380 million year old specimen, and as they dissolved the rock around it, and you can see the top picture on the right is from the fossil prior to dissolving, and then when they dissolved the rock around it to expose the bones, this is a cartilage that is essentially really calcified, and it kind of is that linking point between maybe sharks that were starting to already lose that calcium. So let's jump back in and talk about the different types of cartilaginous fish. First, we have skates and rays. Now, skates and rays tend to be very flattened, disc-like body. Essentially, they have an enlarged pectoral fin that's fused with the head. Now, stingrays specifically and their relatives. So stingrays give live birth, they're viviparous, but stingrays themselves do have a sharp venomous barb on the back of their tail. Now, it's not totally at the very end, it's sort of midway through. Now, manta rays, on the other hand, they feed on plankton. They're the big, large ones you see kind of cruising around up in the pelagic zone, and they don't have barbs at all. Now, skates, they do lay eggs, they're oviparous, and they lack barbs, but they do have these sharp little projections and short tails. So that's the difference between them and stingrays. Now, sawfish, on the other hand, they are really cool. They're one of my favorites. And they're a shark-like in form, but they have this long, flat snout with tooth-like projections. And they use this for slashing and impaling small fish so they can come by and pick it up later and eat it. Unfortunately, this amazing animal is endangered, and it's due to bycatch, essentially when they get caught up in fishing nets, but also from habitat loss as well. So they have been endangered for a little while now, and we're working really hard to protect them. Now, there is an incredible diversity in sharks. There's more than 400 species of known shark out there, and they exist in a range of sizes and feeding habits. You've got the smallest, like the little horn shark you see on the right, and of course some of the largest fish in the world, of course, the whale shark, which can get up to about 50 feet in length. So it is incredible diversity of sharks. They have an incredible diversity of lifestyles and eating habits and feeding habits and everything else. Very, very interesting animals. So let's talk fin shape and function. So you may have already noticed that some sharks have a caudal fin, which is the back fin, if you will, the tail fin, that has a larger upper lobe and a smaller lower lobe. Now, this is more drastic in some sharks like the thresher, and then less drastic in others like the mako. So it kind of depends, but that is called a heterocercal caudal fin shape, and it provides forward thrust, obviously, but due to that heterocercal sort of larger upper lobe situation, it essentially Creates more surface on the dorsal side of the muscle for attachment. It's a faster design and provides upward lift, which aids in buoyancy. That's really a key thing there. The thresher shark is really cool because it uses its whip-like tail to actually snap and shock fish to come by and eat them later. Now, the dorsal fin provides stability while swimming, and pectoral fins aid in steering. Now, in terms of skin, we have what we call dermal denticles, and they're a type of overlapping scale that provides protection and improved hydrodynamic efficiency in sharks. Now, essentially, denticles are modified teeth, and they're covered with hard enamel, which is kind of interesting. The tips of the denticles face backwards, which makes them hydrodynamic. But if you ever try to rub shark skin from tail to nose, it's very rough and it can actually cut a little bit too. So it is much better to touch them from head to tail if you're rubbing that skin. It's kind of an interesting fact. For respiration, we have gill slits, which are external openings in which water is taken in at the mouth and passes back in through the gills. There can be between 5 and 7 gill slits, and there are no gill covers, unlike bony fish. Now, we often see both ram ventilation and pumped ventilation in various different species. Now, ram ventilation is when the mouth is open and you swim forward and the water comes in the mouth and past the gills. Pump ventilation is where you kind of pump the gill slits to actually get water to come through. Now, spiracles are essentially vestigial first gill slits in some species, usually bottom dwellers. They tend to be absent and reduced in most sharks, especially when they swim up in the water column a little bit. But you can see them in skates and rays and a few other kind of bottom dwelling sharks, and that helps them pump water through their gill slits when they're on the bottom. Let's talk buoyancy. So sharks, unlike bony fish, do not have swim bladders. So how do they maintain buoyancy? Because they are negatively buoyant. So first off, they have that heterocircle tail, that upper lobe that's larger, that helps give them downward force when they're swimming. So that automatically helps a bit too. They also have a very large liver, a very oily liver too. Now, if you've ever put oil in water, you'll notice it floats to the surface. It's less dense than water. So that increased size of the liver with all the oil it holds helps to make the shark less dense as well. Now, the stomach is very expandable, so it can really take quite a lot of food in at one time, and they're very strong acids. So in terms of digestion, they're really good at dealing with that. Now, some of the larger sharks, especially like white sharks, maintain a higher body temperature than the surrounding water, and that actually helps to aid in quick digestion of food. Now, the intestines have a feature called the spiral valve. Now, the spiral valve essentially is a bunch of tissues that increase surface area within the intestine, and that increased surface area helps to increase nutrient absorption. So if they take in large quantities of food, they're able to process it more efficiently. Reproduction in sharks takes a little bit of time. They have slow growth and they have late sexual maturity in terms of their life cycle. They also have very low fertility and long lifespans. So this in turn means that we don't get a huge increase in sharks very quickly. They do have internal fertilization. So the males have claspers that they use for copulatory purposes to deploy sperm into the females. Now, some species are oviparous, which means they lay eggs, and viviparous, which means they give live births. So there's both different kinds. You can see them pictured over here. Most are what we call ovoviviparous, meaning their eggs develop and hatch within the oviduct inside the female, and the young actually feed on the egg yolks, and they are born alive and fully developed in general, which means little baby sharks do not get any parentage. They're just sent out into the world to go do their thing. Sharks' senses are very well attuned to accessing their prey items, and they're so well refined that, generally speaking, they don't bite humans. We have very, very few shark bites and attacks in the global world, and it is really a testament to how specific sharks are to their prey. So let's look at some of the different shark senses. First of all, we have hearing. So they hear low frequency sounds, which tends to be from sick or wounded fish kind of making weird kind of noises as they move around. They can sense this from kilometers away. Now, in terms of smell, they have nares on either side of their rostrum, and you can see them pictured below. And those paired nostrils essentially can smell 1 drop of blood in 1,000,000 drops of water. So that allows them to hone in a little bit more closely to their prey item as they approach. Now, sharks have a lateral line just like bony fish, and that lateral line senses vibrations in the water. So again, as they start to approach their prey, they can start to sense that vibration. Now, they also have very well developed vision. They are very sensitive to low light conditions, which helps them access prey in sort of dim, twilighty sort of lighting. Now, they have what we call a nictitating membrane, which is this little white flap of skin that comes up over their eyes, and that comes up over their eyes during feeding when they're biting down to help protect them from prey that might be clawing or grabbing or doing whatever they might do. So that's really interesting as well, but they have very good vision. Sharks have a special sense of electroperception, and it's essentially these tiny jelly-filled canals. They're located on the snout or rostrum of the shark, and you can see them pictured over on the left, all those little spots on the rostrum. And they're called ampulla of Lorenzini, and they aid in detecting electrical currents at very short ranges. This allows them to hone in on prey, especially in murky water where it's hard to see. And of course, taste is also very highly developed as well. They can detect essentially the energy content in the prey. So they tend to go after prey items that have a higher energy content or higher fat content. All of these sensory systems are used in concert with each other to hone in on prey items and be very deferential to what they actually bite and attack and eat. So that is one of the reasons why sharks don't tend to interact with humans negatively, although it does happen for sure. There are obviously a number of reported attacks each year, but considering the sheer amount of people in the water around sharks every year, it's very, very few cases. Let's focus on how important sharks are to the marine environment, especially their ecological roles. Now, they fill a lot of ecological niches, from apex predator all the way to scavenger, and their roles are vast. They promote biodiversity, they maintain the balance between predator and prey, and they often serve as keystone species and indicators of ocean health. When you essentially see something wrong with the sharks, you generally see things wrong with the rest of the ecosystem. Let's look at some examples in terms of ecological roles. So in New England, we have a situation where haddock, which is a type of fish, is overfished. It's a bony fish. This ends up increasing dogfish and skate populations. Now, dogfish is a small shark. You can see it's the second picture down on the left. And this really is due to the fact that the haddock shares similar prey items. So this reduces interspecific competition. So let's give an example of tuna and tiger sharks. So tiger sharks eat tuna, right? So there's a predator-prey relationship there. Now, what's happened in a lot of tropical regions is there's been a large-scale removal of tiger sharks, and this has ended up decreasing tuna populations. Now, you might think that's strange because the sharks eat the tuna, but what's happening is the tuna, once they don't have the tiger sharks around anymore, they let their guard down, they stop schooling so tightly, and that increases the opportunities for other predators to take out tuna. And so the tuna generally then get picked off easier, and thus their population goes down. Now here's another example off the US mid-Atlantic coast. So as shark populations have decreased, their prey, the cownose rays, have increased. Now the cownose rays population eat oysters, scallops, and quahogs, clams, and things like that on the bottom. So essentially what's happening is, due to the decrease in sharks, oysters, scallops, and quahogs and clams are all decreasing in population. And that can lead to a series of cascade effects in terms of environmental quality, because oysters, for example, help filter water. Now let's look at coral reefs. Did you know that sharks are important to coral itself? Because what happens is essentially as sharks are overharvested and their numbers go down, that means the larger predatory fish that sharks usually control, like groupers, they tend to increase in population. And those other predators tend to target more specifically herbivores like tangs and things like that. This decreases the number of primary consumers. Now we're talking algae, right? Because primary consumers eat algae. And thus, algae starts to become a problem on the reef and becomes competition for space and resources with coral. And thus, coral becomes covered in algae. We've referenced a couple of instances of shark populations decreasing and that impact on the ecosystem. So let's talk about shark decreases in general. So here's an example of a blue shark. Now, they were once common in temperate and tropical waters between Norway and New Zealand, so globally. But their fins are highly prized internationally through shark finning. And they are also caught as bycatch, meaning that they didn't mean to be caught, but they caught as other targeted species are being sought after. Now, what happens either way is the blue shark dies, right? Because if it's being targeted for fins, what ends up happening is the fins are removed while the rest of the shark is thrown back. It is estimated that 20 million blue sharks are killed each year. Blue sharks are now listed on the IUCN as a near threatened species. The blue sharks are not the only threatened shark species out there. We have a lot of problems, but it also is not just an ecosystem issue. It's also an economic issue. With the decline of bony fish, a surge in commercial fishing of cartilaginous fish has occurred, meaning that a lot of people are going out there now targeting sharks specifically. Now, game fishing provides a huge economic benefit to coastal communities, including our own, when you think about things like tourism, charter boats, and food and lodging that goes along with it. A lot of different parts of the shark are used, including liver oil, which is harvested for a lot of things like vitamin A, preserving leather, lubricants, cosmetics, and even some medicinal properties. Shark fins are used. They are a delicacy in China, specifically for shark fin soup. Now, the fin itself doesn't really add any flavor. It's kind of tasteless in terms of the soup, and it also doesn't have any medicinal properties, so that's an issue with that. Now, denticles, the skin of the shark, can be used for a variety of purposes, as sword hilts. The shark leather itself is actually more durable than cowhide, so for boots, belts, and wallets. The spines of stingrays are used as needles and spear tips. There's also ecotourism. Now, sharks can bring in a lot of money because people like to go and see them. The Bahamas actually did a little bit of research, and they found that one shark can bring a fisherman who lands it about $50, but alive to the community, it's worth somewhere along the lines of $250,000. So that's a huge difference. Now, in Belize, one whale shark can bring about $2 million in over its lifetime in terms of diving tourism. So these animals are very much worth it alive. All right, that is all for today. Make sure you check out those targeted learning goals that are here on the slide. And of course, until next time, keep learning.